Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our series on
Welcome
key
to the
battles in
History
Revolutionary War.
Unplugged podcast,
In the last episode,
the unscripted
America
show
is
that
triumphant.
celebrates unsung
Washington
heroes,
bravely crosses the
myth-busts
Delaware
historical
River,
lies,
not
and
quite in the way that we
rediscovers
see in
the forgotten
painting. He's
stories
not in a
that
rowboat.
changed our
The
world.
walls are much higher.
I'm your
and he's
host,
not gonna make himself
Scott
such an easy
Rank.
target for sharpshooters. So, James, would you say that the Revolutionary War is basically over at this point, and there's no hope for the British?
Oh, no. That was just an embarrassing minor defeat, let's say, at Trenton and Princeton, or two defeats, or three, depending on how you count it. But, oh no, they've still got plenty of soldiers and plenty of resolve to defeat this rebellion.
They are down, but they are not out. Yeah, the Americans did defeat the Redcoats at Trenton and Princeton, but from at least a strategic standpoint, you can see how the British are still in a really good situation. All they'd really have to do is find a way to sever communication in New England. The British Navy could easily patrol the Hudson. And if you can separate communication in New England, then you can crush regions individually. So it looks good on paper, but there are some problems underneath the surface. They're bubbling to the surface. Howe's troop strength is a problem. We always think of the Americans as having the problems keeping their army together, and they do. But it's not easy to be able to maintain troop numbers. American armies can seem like they dissolve at the drop of a hat, but they can also seem to grow out of thin air. British casualties are a lot more difficult to replace because it takes about a month to move troops from England to North America. And recruitment in England isn't going too well. Almost from the beginning, the king had to recruit large numbers of Scottish Highlanders and Catholic Irish, and using mercenaries from German principalities. Even if you are a Tory, even if you are a loyalist in America, the troops fighting for the British could seem as equally foreign to you as they would to a patriot. And then another problem that we're really going to see in this episode is British treatment of civilians. Even if you have pro-British policies as an American, you're starting to feel alienated by British and Hessian troops. So if you're a woman, whether you're a Tory or a patriot, there are many who were raped, they were abused. Civilians are advised to stay indoors at night. Those caught outside were often beaten and robbed. If you complain to the British authorities, that really didn't do you much good, and it could be seen as treasonous, especially if you were a merchant and an officer was in your debt, then hey, just lock him up. Okay, my debt is taken care of. So all that to say, as we're going to see in this episode, treatment of civilians is something that over the long arc of the war is going to turn the population against the British. That's where we are. James, I'm really excited to meet our next British commander. He's a very colorful character out of a whole cast of colorful characters. Set this up for us. Who's going to lead things as we get into Saratoga?
All right. Well, this commander is a lot of fun. We're gonna enjoy him while we have him, which won't be too long, but not to give too much away here. But if our listeners remember, quite some time ago, we talked about how when Thomas Gage was still in charge of the British forces in North America, and they were in Boston, he received some reinforcements, and with those reinforcements came three major generals. One of them was William Howe, who we've seen ended up replacing Gage, and as we're talking right now, Howe is still the overall commander in charge of the British forces in North America. There was Henry Clinton, and the third one was General John Burgoyne. Burgoyne, we're going to give him a little bit of a mini biography here because he's just a very colorful character, as Scott mentioned, and as I said, lots of fun. So let's dig into his pre-Revolutionary War career. His father was a captain in the army, but he had little money, and Burgoyne himself, John Burgoyne, joined the army as a teenager. And he married young into a noble family, so he knew how to marry well. But like a lot of people in high society, he gambled heavily, and he had to end up selling his commission to pay his debts. Our listeners may remember that in the British Army, if you wanted to be an officer at this time, you didn't go to the equivalent of West Point or anything like that. There was no ROTC, or you just bought it. So you had to pay a certain amount of money depending on what rank you wanted. So he had gotten a lieutenant's commission, but he had to actually sell that. So he had to give up being a lieutenant in the army and let somebody else take his place so that he could take the money and pay off his debts. And then he fled to France to flee the other ones, because that's what you do, right? If you can't pay your debts, you run. And then finally, his father-in-law paid his debts. That was very nice of him to do, and got him another commission in the army. And this is just in time for the 7 Years' War. So during the 7 Years' War, Burgoyne commanded a dragoon unit with excellent. Dragoons are kind of like cavalry, a different kind of cavalry back then. And by 1760, Burgoyne was a colonel in charge of a light dragoon regiment. I can't even say it right. He fought in Europe. He did not fight in North America like some of the other British and American commanders that we've mentioned. But Burgoyne captured Valencia, Spain, and became a hero. He was very popular with his men. Just a lot of fun to be around. Great guy, good man to have at a party. 1761, he became a member of Parliament, and there he constantly lobbied for a more prestigious command. He had his sights set on being a general, not just a colonel. Finally, in 1775, as I alluded to earlier, he was sent to Boston along with Clinton, and also Cornwallis was sent. Cornwallis at the time was a brigadier general. From Boston, Burgoyne constantly wrote letters complaining about Gage, Howe, and Clinton. Like a lot of these British generals, he thought he was the best and the others were inferior to him. Later that year, he was put in charge of a force sent north to drive the Patriots' northern army out of Canada. But there he conflicted with Sir Guy Carleton, the British governor of Canada. So even though Burgoyne was loved by his men, he was not loved by other generals. Finally, we'll just mention again that he loved wine, women, song, and the high life, so much so that he was nicknamed Gentleman Johnny.
Yeah, I love those reverse nicknames, Little John, like in Robin Hood myth. Burgoyne is interesting. He's sort of like the Hessians we saw 2 episodes ago. Their ineptness made them legends. We think that with the Battle of Trenton, that the Hessians are absolutely dead drunk lying in the streets, and Washington, the Patriots, roll over them. Not the case. Similar with Burgoyne, there are legends about him that aren't exactly true. One of them having to do with his wine, women, and song reputation when he goes on the Saratoga campaign. The legend is that he not only brings along his mistress, but he brought along 4 cartloads of belongings that belonged to his mistress, or at least he brought a lot of unnecessary stuff. Well, he did, but it's not quite to the excess that some of the legend says. That might be oral history. There is a book called Burgoyne and the Saratoga Campaign by Douglas Cubison, and he went through Burgoyne's papers. What he found was that Cubison was loved by his men, as James said. He was held in high admiration, and he brought along some unnecessary stuff, but it wasn't cartloads and cartloads, as if he was bringing a player piano and, I don't know, a plaster bust of the head of Aristotle to equip his office. It's more that he doesn't prepare too well in the campaign, so it makes it seem that he's more careless than he actually is. We'll get into this more later, and this will make more sense, but plenty of legends about him because he's such an interesting fellow.
All right. So, yes, interesting fella. Definitely. He's not some kind of wimp or anything. I mean, he definitely wants to fight and he wants to defeat the American army. He's not just there for the party, but he'll try to bring as much as the party as he can with him, but not as much as has previously been thought, perhaps. All right, so here's his plan. It's actually a very good plan. Like a lot of plans, we'll see if it actually works out or not. So Burgoyne went to London and presented a plan to Lord George Germain. He was the British Secretary of State for North America. And the plan was as follows. So there are going to be 3 different forces that are going to join forces. They're going to combine their efforts, and hopefully, as Scott already alluded to, and I've already alluded to in a previous episode, we're going to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. So here's how it would work. One force under the command of Burgoyne himself would march south from Montreal down the Hudson River Valley. He wanted 8,000 British regulars, 2,000 Canadian militia, and 1,000 Indian scouts. He's not going to get near that much, but he will get a pretty good-sized army to start with. So he's going to go south from Canada. The second, smaller force would invade New York from Niagara, which is to the west, through the Mohawk Valley and link up with Burgoyne's force at Albany. And this is going to be under the command of a colonel named Barry St. Ledger, or some people I've seen it pronounced Silliger, so I don't know which one is correct, but it's spelled ST period and then LEGER, so I'm just going to say St. Ledger. The third force was going to be Howe's force, which we've already discussed in some length. This is the same army that kicked George Washington out of New York and all the way into Pennsylvania. Howe's army, according to Burgoyne's plan, would march north from New York City and also join with Burgoyne. So the three forces are going to converge at Albany. And again, as I've already said, this would cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. The combined army would turn then and crush New England, which was the heart of the rebellion. There was a lot more loyalist sentiment in New York and some of the middle colonies as well as the southern colonies than there was in New England. A lot of the British commanders and even some of the politicians back in London thought if we could just throw a bunch of these New England guys in jail and defeat the army in New England, the other colonies will fall into line. So that's what the plan is. So Germain says, yeah, that's a good plan. He approved it. Burgoyne returned to Canada, sending a letter to Howe, notifying him, that is Howe, of his plans via a letter that he wrote on the way. So that is the plan. How does that sound to you, Scott? Good plan?
Plans on paper are always fantastic. They never fail. Now, reality sometimes intrudes. So what happens when these plans crash against the rocky shores of reality?
Yeah, there were some, I can't remember which famous general in history said this, but they said a plan only lasts as long as the minute the battle starts, and then it goes out the window or something like that. So,
or Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Same kind of idea.
Exactly. Yeah. So here's what happened. Burgoyne assembled 8 regiments and was ready to set off from Fort St. John, which is just south of Canada, on June 12th. This is 1777, by the way. We're into 1777. But he was ordered to leave 2 regiments behind, so he left with only 3,700 regular troops. That is less than half of what he really wanted, but he'll have to make do. But he was also given 3,000 Hessians, jawohl, and 450 Canadians and Loyalists, and about 400 Indians. So this gave him a total of about 7,500 men, give or take. Still far less than he wanted. He had requested about 11,000. But 7,500 men, that's a pretty good sized force. He had many artillery pieces, although it would be very difficult to transport them. Remember, we keep saying this again and again. We sound like a broken record, but it bears repeating that roads are either horrible or non-existent. It depends on what part of the country you're in. So they're going to have to do a lot of their traveling down alongside rivers, in particular this time the Hudson River and Lake Champlain. Well, Lake Champlain and then the Hudson River.
Think of Napoleon's army getting stuck in Russian mud as they're trying to invade Russia. Same kind of thing happening here. And one other point, too, perhaps you could consider it a strategic mistake in hindsight. I don't know if it would be at the time. But the enlistment of those 400 Indians bothered Americans due to the nature of frontier life, where you don't have a Geneva Convention or war crimes, but at least from the American side, they would think that enlisting Indians would violate the proper conduct of war, since from their perspective, they would imagine raiding parties and the Indians not fighting according to decorum, but raiding, perhaps scalping people. That was their perspective. Many Americans are thinking, well, first the British are bringing over Hessian mercenaries, now they're enlisting Indians that could wreak havoc on them, not just fight them and conquer them. And even when Burgoyne left for Fort Edward on the Hudson River, there was a party of Indians that attacked the farm of the Tory, John Allen, in Camden Valley and killed and scalped his entire family. These are the stories that get spread around. This is something that doesn't warm up American sentiment. And that's one other thing I just want to mention before we get into the march.
As we saw, Burgoyne had another force that he was hoping to link up with under Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Leger. He's off to the west, and he's supposed to march eastward toward Burgoyne. So on June 20th, Burgoyne issues a proclamation to the people of New England that read, and this is a quote, he said, "I have but to give stretch to the Indian forces under my direction, and they amount to thousands, to overtake the hardened enemies of Great Britain and America. I consider them the same, wherever they may lurk. If notwithstanding these endeavors and sincere inclinations to effect them, the frenzy of hostility should remain, I trust I shall stand acquitted in the eyes of God and men in denouncing and executing the vengeance of the state against the willful outcasts." don't mess with me or I'm going to destroy you.
I suppose one could consider this